Hi, everybody, and welcome to our event today. It's really great to have you all here. I see a lot of familiar faces, both online and in person. My name is Marino, and this is an event that's part of our series in the ELIT monthly reading group. This is something that, in addition to teaching, I organize a monthly group which is made up of undergrads, grads, faculty, staff, anybody interested in electronic literature, which is something we don't talk about a lot in our class. I have no idea why, but it is my research area. And it's really an honor to have my two colleagues here today, who are my collaborators, that I can't wait to introduce you to. But let me just tell you a couple other things. So if you're interested in the ELIT monthly reading group, just put your name on the chat or give me your email at some point and I'll add you guys to the list. And basically, this group is just trying to informally experience what happens to the book after it stops being a book and it goes digital. Or once we don't talk about books anymore, what are digital literary endeavors that could happen? And of course, our current NetProv that we're playing, the Grand Exhibition of Prompts, is one of those works that we think is part of this world of electronic literature. And I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that, but that's something you guys can all get involved in, you folks at home as well. Our sponsors today are the HACS Lab, the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab, which I direct. And of course, I'd love to have any of you guys involved in it. If you're interested in the social meaning of computer source code, then this is for you. The Ahmanson Lab, we have Matt here as our representative of the Ahmanson Lab. This is beautiful space we're in. I'll at least do the camera around thing so you can see it. Just this wonderful room that we're in with folks lining up. It's standing room. It's hard to see. It's standing room only. But we had to keep some people out, but that's okay. They'll just have some FOMO going on. And we have the writing program. Tech Committee is one of the sponsors. That's the committee that I'm on, and we talk about teaching with technology. I've got my great co-chair, Maddox, right there, who's in attendance, and I don't know if we have any other members from that committee who are here, but yeah, shout out to the committee for sure. So we're grateful for all those sponsors. So guys, it's my absolute pleasure. I could not be happier than to have dragged up my two collaborators and colleagues to give this talk today. And thank you to Curtis too, by the way, of the Ahmanson Lab, who just arrived with some refreshments, which again, I have no way of sharing with you people who are online, so I apologize. And I should ask, so I'm assuming volume's okay for you people on Zoom? Okay, good. So my two colleagues are just couldn't be better collaborators and creative scholars and critical thinkers in the world of digital culture, digital arts. I'm gonna do a little here's their bio, and then I'll go off. I'll do a little unplugged bit about it. So Diana Leong is an assistant professor of English and comparative literature at San Diego State University. Her research interests include environmental justice, Black literature, and studies in the environmental humanities. She's currently completing a monograph that we're all eagerly awaiting, Against Wind and Tide, toward a slave ship ecology, that theorizes the slave ship as a site for the convergence of environmental justice and abolition. Her works have also appeared in many different journals, and well, first, let's just get a big round of applause for her. I gotta be the cameraman too. Have I gotten you? Here, wait. I think do I have to pin us? I have to pin us for a second. Let's pin us. Yeah.
About the lifting her skirt and the work.
Okay. All right. That'll be good. That'll be extra points there. Well, probably not. If you ask that. I gotta be careful about what I say. All right. And my other colleague is here. Jessica Pressman is a professor of English and comparative literature at San Diego State University. So they get 2 of the 3 people in this presentation. So they're super lucky. Where she co-founded San Diego State's Digital Humanities Initiative. She's the author of Bookishness, which is floating around on the table, Digital Modernism, another fantastic book. She's a co-author with myself and Jeremy Douglas of Reading Project, which is also floating around. And that's another collaborative, come on in, Alex. And that's another collaborative scholarly work. And it's not something that we've talked about so much in our class, but a lot of my recent work has been collaborations only. I think the best scholarship happens not by like some little monk in a little cell somewhere, but with people who are working together and coming up with ideas together. So, I mean, I think that's always been true. Anyway, don't get me started. Anyway, she also co-edited 2 volumes, Comparative Textual Media, and also Book Presence in a Digital Age. Which embarrassingly, that's the one I don't have that one. She says that's all right. Anyway, let's give a round of applause for so before we get started, I just want to give you a little context about this piece. Thank you, sir. There was a call from the Electronic Literature Organization. And the Electronic Literature Organization is like an international group of scholars and artists who are all interested in digital literature. And it's been around since 1998. Have you guys ever heard of the Electronic Literature Organization? Okay, well, as its communications director, I take that as a personal failure. But that's okay. That's okay. Curtis heard about it, so that's good. One. That's really, Jessica's heard of it. So has Diana. Anyway, it's a great organization, and they put out a call, and that I think must have had ecology in the title. Do you remember what the call was for that? Yeah. The ocean, yeah, platforms. Platforms was it. And so our pitch was the ocean as platform. We had one more collaborator, Melody Jew, who is in Santa Barbara, and she does a lot of work on oceans. And so our initial thought was, well, obviously, was what could we talk about? And I think it is possible that I was aware of this work called FISHNETSTOCKINGS by Joellyn Rock because I got to see it in person. She's in Minnesota. She's in Duluth, Minnesota, with another person we've talked about in this class, Rob Wittig, who is, again, co-responsible for the Grand Exhibition of Prompts. They are partners, in fact. And once I was visiting them, and I got to go to this green screen lab where she had fishnet stockings set up, and I got to interact with it, and my kids were with me, and they were younger, and they were smaller, and they had a blast, and my wife was there too, so it was good times all around. So I was aware of this work, and I was also aware of one more thing, which was that one of my colleagues was interested in writing, or perhaps becoming, a mermaid, and that was Dr. Jessica Pressman. You have a lot of mermaid stuff with you? Are you gonna bring? Should we reveal it now, or you want to reveal it later? What do you got? You got a mermaid journal. She's got a mermaid pendant. You guys a little pricey momentarily.
So why not write about that in a scholarly way?
Were those mermaid socks? Did I miss mermaid socks? Oh, mermaid tattoo. There you go. All right. So lots of mermaid stuff. So I knew she was writing. In fact, I had a sneaking suspicion that her research was headed in this direction because I knew that for a fact. So I knew this was a mermaid piece. So we had some pieces, right? And then she's got mermaid earrings, you'll see as well. So I can't remember who came on next. I think then you brought on Diana because you said I've got another colleague who's going to add a great dimension to this. Race and environment. Okay, and again for people at home, that's history of racism and technology was she could bring on. And then we connected with Melody, who was studying the ocean as a environment or media or part. So we put all those people together. We knew that I knew we would have a really useful, like, maybe pardon all the puns, maybe don't pardon the puns. Like this would be a good dive, like collaborative dive into the space. And the other thing you need to know is that we had sort of done something like this before. I guess most easily said in this book, people at home, so you can buy your copies. Reading project where Jessica and I and another colleague, Jeremy Douglas, you guys, I think I mentioned him before. We looked at one work of electronic literature together, and again, the exploration was always ended up being more than the sum of our parts, like the sum of our insights. So again, you think about the papers you guys write for any of the classes or my class, for example. And now imagine if you were writing them with other people and imagine their insights and all the collaborations, all the fruits of those collaborations. Okay, so let's show you a little bit of this work so you get a sense of it. First of all, I'm going to show you some video footage from it. And I think that, I guess this might give us what we want. Oh, wait, there are people at home, aren't there? I've got people at home, I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see what's going on as you're wondering. Okay, so I'd love to immerse you in this piece. You have to imagine a few things. And one of the things you have to imagine is that it's complete wall-size projection in the room, right? The room's completely dark. We got a full wall screen projection. And then we have Microsoft Connect set up in the back. And then the people can interact with what's happening on the screen. And at the same time, we have one of the versions were pulled from Twitter because there was a hashtag. And the other occasions were pulled from Google Doc. And again, if you didn't get one of these, you can take a content, if you will. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Fishnet Stockings has it takes on the story, the fables, the myths of the tales of mermaids, in particular, the Little Mermaid. Now, when you think of that, you might be thinking of the Disney film, which ends up being maybe not the ideal version of that story in Joellyn Rock's work, but it is a touchstone, a cultural touchstone, as well as many other stories of mermaids. And so there's this 3-act structure we talked about, I think, at the beginning, and I'm going to call up that list again of the acts. So we have Act 1 is innocence and curiosity. Act 2 is shipwreck and rescue. Act 3 is bad bargains and good exchange rates. And so all 3 of these have corresponding different elements of what you can interact with on the screen at that moment. So for example, here's Act 1, and we see people interacting with jellyfish and some merfolk. And you could tell that there's, they're like moving their hands towards them. And when they move their hands towards them, the jellies will come around them, but they won't collide with them. Like they'll sort of come into their environment. And we'll talk about how that works a little bit later. Oh, wait, here's my son back in the day. I was enjoying playing with him. Oh, that's me. I'm running away from the jellyfish. I think I was the only person who ever did that. Anyway, and then in Act 2, there's a shipwreck and you have a net. And the primary interaction here is you work collaboratively with somebody else and you catch the ship in a net. And again, what I'm not calling out that I hope is very apparent to you is that part of the beauty of this piece is that Joellyn Rock's collage aesthetic. And she's working with some wonderful paper cutting artists who contributed actual paper cuts that were then scanned in, turned into images, put into this piece, and then layered upon layered upon layered. And we have other things. We have like the original Hans Christian Andersen tale. The original manuscript of that is also layered onto this. So we've got, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of a palimpsest, but we have this like layer upon layer upon layer of this little mermaid stories, including some like this is footage of somebody wearing a mermaid tail swimming. I don't know if I'm assuming they're swimming in a swimming pool. I think we have that documented somewhere, but I'm not remembering now. Joellyn, you can chime in with where they were swimming if you'd like. And then in our last case, we're making our bad bargains, and the mechanic here is a slicing mechanic that like a chopping. You know, it's almost like you're chopping up fish, right? But you'll see what they're doing. So it kind of works as I seem to be dragging that, wishing. There we go. We got our working dancers. So there's our fish that will appear eventually. And there's the chopping motion we do. And I do believe that that's my dog. In that particular shot. Okay, so I think that gives you some orientation to the piece. Again, you all have those QR codes. If you wanted to write any themed lines that might show up, and we can give you suggestions or time for that later on, you could add it to the piece, and then those could be incorporated in later. And again, there's sort of like single line riffs off of various versions of the story. And by riffs, I mean that some of them are puns, and some of them are plays on things that happen in the story, and some of them are, you know, people sort of on a verbal level getting entangled with this larger myth. So that leads us to our Scalar book. Let me show you what that is. So Scalar, if you don't know what it is a wonderful multimedia scholarly platform created by folks here at USC. Eric Lawyer and Craig Dietrich were big members of that development team. And you guys write papers, you know, a lot of you are in my writing class, and so you write papers for me, and you're used to writing these in a nice linear way. But the beautiful thing about Scalar is it's a non-linear platform, or what I really should say is a multi-linear platform for scholarship. So here, there's a little video here where I give an orientation to it. I'm not going to make you watch the orientation since I'm here, but I give you a little bit of a description. But what you need to know is that in Scalar, you can take any element, and the first thing you do is put it on a path. So let's say I had several arguments I want to make, or several themes I want to bring out about a work. I could put them all on different paths. Even I can put the same work on multiple paths, but I create a path through the work. So let's say, for example, the Little Mermaid, or Mermaids, maybe I want all of the images to show up in a path. Okay, well, I can do that. Or Act 1, I can make a path for Act 1. The other thing that I can do with Scalar that's harder for me to describe in the time that we have here today is that any element can be any kind of element that they have in there. So that's a little bit hard for me to explain, but maybe the easiest way to say is, let's say I showed you this video clip and I wanted to annotate the video clip by putting an image, let's say, I don't know, 3 minutes in. I want an image to come up, and I want it to maybe comment on that a little bit. So I could do that. Or let's say I have the text of the Little Mermaid, and I want to annotate that with a video clip from some part of the exhibition. So I could have the text of the Little Mermaid, and there's a little annotation, and it takes you to a video clip from Joellyn's piece. Or what if I wanted to make one of those a path? I can do that. Or if I want to show you the code, and inside the code, if I want to make an annotation in the code that pulled up one of the images, I can do that. Or a video or text. So I can, another way of saying that is I can tie all of these little elements together in lots of different ways, in ways that's hard to do in writing when you're just using words. I mean, you can make those gestures, but here I can bring you into the text of the story, and I can say, oh, that's evocative of this image. In fact, I can show you the image now because I've annotated the story with that. Anyway, I could go on, but I'm not going to. I'll do one more little bit of the tour and then we'll bring up our guests. And we probably should bring you guys up physically because, so you'll be on camera, sorry. So if you look on this left side, under the table of contents, you see some of the paths that we've made. So for example, if you go into hybridity, here's a path that you could follow through the story where we try to contextualize different elements of the piece and we reflect on different ways that hybridity came up in this piece. And again, part of the beauty of working in Scalar is that at any point that you're making your arguments, you can illustrate it with text or video or whatever it is you might want to illustrate it with. It's one of the best platforms for multimedia scholarship I've ever seen, and it's open source and something that you can use and access for free. Okay. That was a lot more intro than I planned to do, folks. So let me bring you guys up now. Yeah. All right. Well, why don't we start by you both talking a little bit about your interest in fishnet stockings to begin with, and then I will.
Okay.
Almost should I start?
You want me to move over here?
Do you need the Scalar book up at all, or just was the?
You can maneuver if you want.
Well, let's put you up.
Oh. Hi. Okay. Well, hi, it's nice to be here. Thanks for having us and thanks for listening. I just want to say a word about Scalar, because if you don't know about it, it is like one of the signal, I would say, gifts and offerings to the scholarly community that you guys are in the home place of it. And it has really changed, I think changed what scholarship can be. And I know we're going to talk later about like how this project changed the way that we do work. I will just say a few of my graduate students have written their final culminating essays and MA theses in Scalar, and really changes the way that you think about a work and collaboration. So I know that you're working with Professor Marino, and so you're learning about how media changes the way that you think, and
It's
not just a tool.
Because you know what they know me as.
Oh, Coach, sorry, right. You work with Coach, and Coach is sharing with you how technology is not just a tool that we use, but a tool that transforms the way that we think and work. And for me, this collaboration has truly that's been a big payoff. And even getting to see it on screen, like rather than the little screens that we work on, you see it differently, and you think about it differently. Sorry, that wasn't what you asked me to talk about.
Oh, that's good. Well, and I guess what we haven't talked about is
I just wanted to make that like Scalar is huge, and you guys are here, and I hope you can take advantage of it. It's like amazing.
and I should mention that book that's floating around, Reading Project, Scalar was a tool that we used very heavily to help us explore that work.
At the end, though, more so. Like that's the difference. Is we wrote that book. Where is that book? That book floating around. We wrote that book in Google Docs collaboratively. And then we put the ideas and the code, especially, right? That's what we into a Scalar book to see how it would transform it. But we, this grouping, wrote everything for Scalar. So we're really conceiving of it differently. Like, how could image and text and code be actually part of the interpretive process, not something that we do later? I think that was a shift for me in understanding it.
Yeah, there's a moment in the argument where you want to say, I want to make this point, but it would really help if you have seen this work of art or this historic work that Diana has found.
Yeah, the Kara Walker pieces.
Right.
It's annotated with that. Yeah.
And I could call those up if we want, but again, but without those, it's almost impossible. Like you can gesture towards them, but then being able to show them makes a big difference. Okay, but that wasn't what you guys were supposed to talk about.
Oh.
You guys were supposed to talk about what attracted you first. Well, that's what we were going to start off.
Okay.
What attracted you to this?
Mine was easy because mermaids. I've always been fascinated by mermaids, and I just started a new book on contemporary mermaid narrative. So I'm writing a book about the mermaid craze of the last 15 years, especially. It's everywhere. You see mermaids in film and TikTok and mermaid tales, professional mermaids, videos for every genre, every region, contemporary. So when Mark brought this piece to me, and I'm really fascinated by the aesthetics of it, the kind of the layering, the palimpsest, even just the kind of aesthetics of old mermaid imagery and contemporary mermaid imagery. I never got to experience it in person as an installation piece, although I have seen work by the creator, different works, the one that you worked on, by Salt and Sea, is that what it's called?
Yeah, the Salt and Mortal Sea.
Salt
That's
and
the name of
Mortal
that one,
Sea,
yeah.
which is beautiful. So I was really fascinated by thinking about like what draws an artist to think about the Little Mermaid 1837 text through digital technology today in an immersive space. And it gave me an opportunity to really like dive into the work and think about it.
And you?
I'm getting there.
I followed Jessica into the room and found myself there.
Okay, here it is, and then I'll share
Yeah,
screen while you're
this is a
talking.
great example of this.
Okay, there you go.
Well, there's also there's one more book, which connects our work, which is The Deep.
Oh,
Do
yeah.
you guys know River Solomon's novel, The Deep
And Lagoon.
and Lagoon?
It has a bow on it because Jessica did.
Do you know this book? It's a novel. It's kind of sci-fi, kind of Afrofuturism. Anyway, it's something that I'm obsessed with. I think it's brilliant. And it inspired me to think it's based on the idea that enslaved people that either jumped or were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage, that the babies born of pregnant women became merfolk, and that there's this alternative world of Black mermaids that offers an alternative to the terrestrial land of white supremacy and colonialism, basically. And my colleague Diana Leong works on race and technology and Black studies and Black literature. So there was a connection there in terms of thinking about how might mermaid stories, and particularly this new genre of Black mermaid fiction, which is radical and offers alternative to the kind of terrestrial white colonialist model. So that's why I brought you in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
First time I've heard that. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, so when Jessica invited me to comment on the piece, I was at the moment looking at some of the iconography of the slave trade, including the famous image of the Brooks that opens the hall to sort of detail the arrangement of captive Africans in the hull and the hold. I was also looking in conjunction with the Brooks at some of the silhouette portraiture that had been done around the same time that was sort of a precursor to photography. One of the really first or the earliest populist art forms, right? Portraiture, and it sort of enjoyed a resurgence to the work of artist Kara Walker in the last couple of years. So the actual piece of paper cutouts that Fishnet Stocking uses includes some very similar sort of similarly rendered silhouettes. And I thought that what Joellyn Rock was doing with them were really interesting. Something about the way that the mermaid silhouettes in her piece invited the reader to sort of recode race. I thought a really creative race was really appealing to me. And then thanks to Mark, I became interested in the actual coding behind it. I don't have mermaids, or fish, but I have flocking roosters.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
also don't think roosters flock, but it's close enough.
I love it. I love it.
You have to explain the flocking.
Oh, yeah.
Is it a good time to
Yeah.
finish read?
Yeah, but
Brief
let me
aside or
just
no?
point out that also in terms of the silhouettes and the paper making, that Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote
The mermaid also.
that was his thing. Like if you go to his museum and house in Odense, which I have, so obsessed. He did a lot of paper cutting. So there's a kind of historical connection there as well in the biography.
And we also found during the summer of 2020, during the sort of global protests over George Floyd's homicide, we found the base of the Little Mermaid statue had been spray painted at some point with the phrase racist fish. And we've been sort of doing a deep dive trying to figure out the connections between Anderson's original fairy tale and sort of global issues of race and racial justice.
So yeah, flocking. So obviously like one of my bailiwicks or hobby horses or areas of life devotion is the study of the social significance or the meaning of source code. So one of the great things about working on this piece was that we had access to all of the code. So anytime that that's the case, I'm really happy. And a lot of this code was written in processing, which is a visual programming language for artists. It's a lot of things, a lot of programming languages were not made for artists. Fortran was not made for artists. COBOL was not made for artists. But processing, which was created by Casey Reese, who's one of our co-authors on the blue book there, 10print, and Ben Fry created processing as this platform for artists to program in. And so it does very easily, it does things like various kinds of visual rendering and turned out to be really good for parts of this code. It's not all written in processing, but some of it is. And if I show you, I can show you the code but I'm not going to. Instead, I'll talk to you about a little bit of the code. Actually, let me take you to. Well, I'll show you the first thing that came out of the code for me, which is again the easy sell. Because sometimes you find something in the code and it just sort of opens everything up for you. So one of the themes of this piece clearly is hybridity. And it sort of takes me a while to like wrap my head around like what does hybridity mean in this case? And people like Donna Haraway and other digital scholars have really leaned in heavily into this notion of hybridity and to think about our hybrid selves. Even if you just think about the cyborg is Donna Haraway's metaphor for the human being and computer that kind of all of us are, whether we realize it or not at this point. And all you have to see is like that phone that never leaves our hands to know that like we're intimately connected to these devices. Anyway, I had never really thought about the Little Mermaid in terms of hybridity, but all you have to do is stop. If you stop on the notion for a little bit of mermaid, right? And you think about that portmanteau that makes up that word, right? It's just sea, it's got sea and it's got young woman, I guess. Or unmarried woman, I'm not sure. A woman, I guess. Anyway, combined, right? Or more mermen, mermaids, right? You start to see some hybridity. But for me, it took getting into the code, and I saw this thing, this MERS ship. And again, this was over in the assets, and that was its name, the MERS ship. Now, when you look at this image, like the first thing you think is like, oh, it's like a traditional ship that has, and again, I'm sharing screen. Okay, good. You guys can. It's like, oh, it's got this woman on the front, like you see in those classic 18th century sailing vessels or earlier as well. But then when it's called the MERS ship, you see something else, right? That like the ship itself is a mermaid, right? But it's like, oh yeah, this is the front of her, but that's like the tail. That's not a sail. That's like the tail part of it. And then then I started seeing it pretty much everywhere that I went, including in the code. So now I'll have to let me get my little table of contents real quick. And gets us some flocking.
Yeah, the flocking was the thing that did it for me. I was like, oh, sometimes when you collaborate and someone brings something to you that you didn't see before, this certainly happened in the project book, where Mark showed something in the code and it's like, I've spent hours and months reading this work and I've never thought about it that way. And then it changes everything about how you understand. And I remember this conversation, Mark brought something, an insight that we had from the code to all of us, and then he saw something different. And of course, like hopefully everybody has some study of the right that you see something and it changes the way you think about a work that can change the way you think about the world more broadly, right? And you zoom out. So the blocking, hence the shirt.
All right.
It's the oversell our project, but it has changed the world.
And it's
All right, here we go. Here's our flocking code. So early in the process of looking at how this code works, I found this reference to flock. And that's interesting because I've never heard that word flock associated with mermaids before. Like a flock of I don't know, what do you call a group of mermaids?
That's why we started. We
That's
figure
where
out
the
what it
conversation was,
was
right?
called
Like,
the mermaids.
pod, is it a swarm?
Swarm,
Is it a
school.
School. No.
tribe in the Greek. In a lot of literature, there's only one. There isn't one.
So let's see if this will open this for me. Oh, wait, that's just the, all right, sorry, this will take a second. Anyway. So the more I scroll through this code, the more, at some point I realized that this was adapted from other code that was used not to model, and it'll take me a second to call up on Scalar, which is why I'll have to describe it by hand for a second. It was designed not to model the behavior of jellyfish or mermaids, but to model the movement of birds. And in fact, the algorithm for that is older, and it eventually gets called not birds, but boids, which is hilarious because yesterday was my dad's birthday. And my dad used to always tell us this poem that it referred to birds as boids. And so from early on, I knew that like that was like a weird way of referring to birds. Anyway, so there are these boids that show up in the code. In fact, there are merboids that show up in the code. And the further I looked into this algorithm that I'll show you momentarily, the more I realized, oh, wait, these fish, they're acting like birds is what's happening, which again, showed me another way that hybridity shows up in this piece, right? Because the very movement of the things that we're seeing on the screen are encoded with the natural or the modeled natural movement of birds. So they were at once birds and jellies. So let's see if I could.
Oh, sorry, mermaids goes back to sirens when the first were the sirens were actually half female, half bird in the Odyssey, right? And then they get kind of transformed, probably through a mistranslation of the language, into female fish. So the bird stuff's actually really quite cute. And that's what you saw on the screen, right? Isn't that, Mark? Like when you were showing on the screen and you saw the things moving around, that stuff.
I know it's taking me too long to get to this though. Okay, well, while I'm calling up that, I will transition us to one of our other questions so we don't lose time, which is, what is one thing that you discovered? Did we do that one yet? In this collaboration? Let's do that one first. Diana, you want to go first? And you should get on camera while I'm hunting, and I'll stop sharing for a second while I hunt.
Sure. One of the things I learned in this collaboration, it's fun to follow threads that end up nowhere sometimes. Most of them do, but it's also fun to pull on threads and you end up somewhere with an entirely new chapter for your project, which I have actually, maybe even two. Part of what I was interested in is seeing if I could understand race through analog and digital sort of systems of thought, right? If I could sort of think about race as both a signifier that floats and a signifier that flickers. It doesn't map as easily onto these sort of racial markers of information as I would like, but I'm still sort of interested in that and sort of trying to figure out how to bring more Black critical studies into digital humanities, into ELIT, which it has sort of, I think, attracted much more attention in the last 10, 15 years, but there's still sort of a lot of work to go. The other thing that I've discovered though from this is this is back burner manuscript project where I take a technological invention from a work of Black literature, art, or film and traces spatial history. So I do nanotechnology and Midnight Robber, the elevator and the intuitionist. And now one of the chapters are going to be either a digital ELIT or some sort of motion capture technology that's been inspired by this project.
Wow, that's really good.
Yes, I will let you know when it comes out.
Oh my God, that sounds
Oh, when I write it.
that sounds exciting. Okay, all right. What about you, Jessica?
Well, I guess instinctively I've been doing collaborations because it was a research for a long time. But I think this project shows me how I should be doing collaboration from the beginning. Like when this was the first thing I knew I wanted to write on mermaids, knew I want to write a book on, but I hadn't done anything. And so this project really just showed me, wow, I can learn so much about my own thinking and my own, frankly, like lacuna and gaps in the way that I think by working with people at the very beginning stages. So, so I think this kind of going to completely change more of my methodology work than any particular research question. Although the flocking and move flocking now I'm paying attention to what I read. I'm like reading a lot of contemporary mermaid literature. Some of it is very bad, very, very bad.
and I'm still reading it, but now I'm paying more attention to movement and flocking. Like, how are they finding each other? How is that movement described? So flocking.
There you go. All right, so I'll show you. So I'll show you some of the code in action. So what I haven't been able to show you up until this point is what's beautiful about Scalar, and this is thanks to Eric and Craig's hard work, is that it actually gives me the ability to walk through the code and to annotate it with different commentaries. So again, I won't call all these up right now, but my argument is that you can, my larger argument in life, I guess, and through the Hacks Lab is that you can use code as a way to talk about other things. And with Scalar, because I can annotate the code with images, with videos, with other pages, I can literally let the code be the thing that we're looking at, but it's going to allow us to shoot off in all these other directions and see the things that come up when you start to look at it more deeply. And I can make those, I can bring that argument to life. I can make a material metaphor of that argument through Scalar. So let's show you what the flocking code does. So actually the code, one of the things I can do is I can compare the code that's in Joellyn's piece to flocking code that's existent about processing. And then I'll just show you like the way that some of that flocking behavior looks when you, at least as one person has rendered it. Now, Joellyn doesn't have quite so many mermaids in there. But you see, they're also trying to illustrate a little bit of collision detection stuff, right? And how they're dispersing depending on where they are. Anyway, it's kind of mesmerizing, right? And again, just to know that these mermaids were flocking with the code of birds to me was fascinating and something that I wanted to explore more deeply.
When I definitely got melody, this is the other part, like the thinking of the interesting piece to me, because I was new to definitely the ego theory and the criticism, thinking about if birds and mermaids are both flocking in similar ways in water and in air, then how do we understand the environment in the backgrounds of the media? Like thinking about air as a medium and water as a medium, how do they operate differently? How might that code illuminate or frankly be wrong about how bodies move in the so that was confusing.
I was also interested to see like the way the collision detection worked and things like that. And it was interesting. There's some interesting when you start to poke at something a little bit, you start to find some interesting things. Again, going back to a racial dimension, I noticed that my son, who's African-American, was not showing, like being recognized by the system all the times in the room when we were interacting with Joellyn's system. And that's like a known problem of connects, right? Is they're kind of designed with a kind of racial bias in terms of who they recognize as people that are interacting, which again is like this horrible way that technology, replicates social biases that have been institutionalized and hard-coded into the culture, and then they become hard-coded into the technology as well.
And hard-coded into the narrative of mermaids being white.
Right.
It goes back to the racist fish and all this like horrible racist commentary on the new Little Mermaid movie that's coming out, it's live action, it's Black actress Ariel, and the kind of hashtag not my mermaid and make mermaids white again and stuff. That's all they all here, because mermaid stories have never always been white. In fact, they originate in Mesopotamia with non-white people, right? So like the very idea that we would think mermaids should be white is coded into this technology of bias and racism that we're describing, the invisibility of Black bodies on screen.
So I think that's one of the many things. So about Kara Walker's silhouette pieces. Again, now Joellyn's work in silhouettes predates Kara Walker's, but again, she's aware of Kara Walker, and they're like working in a similar medium. So it's interesting to see how they play together. But that world of silhouettes, the world of racism that Diana brought into it, and a much more full understanding of mermaids are what I got out of this collaboration, or at least I'm beginning to get one. So I feel bad dragging these folks all the way up here and us giving just a show talk that we would perhaps have given slightly before. So I do want to open it up to some questions and discussion. And if there's anything else that I left off our little outline that we wanted to say, we could say. I feel like we said everything. Okay, so let's turn into question and answer. And we can also take questions from folks in the Murmuration. Oh, I love that, Joellyn. Joellyn wrote the word murmuration, but that was in response to Elsa Valek's comment. I believe that the Anderson version is a half-fish woman. I just wonder why they use the same word for the Greek ancient siren and the Northern Balkanic siren, because the Medusa is also a hybrid woman, but she is not called a siren. That's interesting. Okay, so what questions do you guys have? Either online or in person?
I'm curious with the flocking, have you explored kind of the connection with sailors misidentifying like seals, manatees, and dolphins? And if you brought that into your flocking of exploring how dolphin pods or groups of seals also.
That's such a good question. I certainly haven't, but that goes back also to the siren and the sound, right? Which is mermaids are always associated with sound, going back to the siren and the siren call. And so what I found interesting, and now actually the question will help me think through it a little bit more, is a lot of the mermaid, good mermaid literature really pays attention to sound, like in this book, you know, how they communicate is not through orality, is through the sound waves on the body, right? Underwater, it's like sound waves, sonar, right? So I haven't thought about that at all. That's a really interesting way to put all these things together.
Yeah. Yeah. Joellyn chimes in with, in response to flocking looking like a murmuration of birds.
Yeah.
She's offered. Yeah. All right. What else? No, what do you got?
You haven't? Yes, I mean, I would just say like, again, I'm like looking at this very short period of mermaid storytelling, and it's really all, one of the reasons I think that we're having the mermaid phrase, especially in literature, is because of climate change. It's all responding to, and especially this kind of, you know, the changing of the ocean, how we're destroying the oceans, but also how humans with our technology are penetrating the oceans, and that's the spaces where mermaids have existed for so long. So there's a lot of concern in this literature. Yeah.
Even on the yeah, as soon as I said I haven't, I'm like, no, I lied.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, there's a way to think about the mermaid as a kind of figure of equal anxiety, right? The sort of half in, literally and metaphorically half in and half out of the climate change solution.
And Diane, I got to get you on stage, so to speak, if you can, without being tripped by my devices. I have and this isn't a spoiler, but you know, you might want to see Wakanda Forever, possibly. I'm not spoiling it. I'm just saying you might want to see it. I'm just saying. I mean, you might want to see it anyway. My daughter has always loved mermaids. She had a mermaid fishtail that she swam in. She identifies as a mermaid as well.
I've always loved to know.
Yeah. And why do you think that fantasy is like, why is that so strong? Is it particularly, why do we love, why do people love mermaids so much? Why do they want to be them? Why is this fantasy so attractive?
Wow. No, I won't answer for everyone, but I do think I've been thinking a lot about that and writing a lot about it. And also writing about the fact that people haven't taken this question seriously, which I also think is part of the question, right? Because it's been related to girls and thus the unserious. There's a lot of, if we even put it in like market capital, mermaid stuff and mermaid entertainment stuff makes a lot of money, but still it's not taken seriously. There's surprisingly very little scholarship on it. There's scholarship on the history of mermaids in like science and religion, but not in literature and culture as being taken seriously, like very little, surprisingly. So the fact that you phrase it that way, that it's like a young girl's thing, is what I'm getting into is part of the reason why we don't take it seriously.
I think it's on purpose though, right? Because otherwise you're left with untamable female desire. Nobody likes that.
Yeah,
If you evangelize it, then it becomes immediately more digestible.
exactly. And part of the history of the mermaid, especially in the 19th century, even before, was like this representation of female sexuality and desire, but without reproductive consequences. But the stories of mermaids, at least for me, are about exploration of other worlds, are about like the hybrid image, about being, you know, and it's an Ariel, and she says, I want to be part of the world. Like that's profound to want to explore the world and travel and escape your own kind of paradigm and bubble. So
there is a kind of empowerment and curiosity, I would even say, too. At least that's how I make myself better about what I'm doing.
I'm not entirely aware of the history of like the lore behind mermaids, but I do know that it's those have like very long time. I was curious when you're talking about like this mermaid phase in cinema and literature. It's like I'm just curious like when did like the genre like start subverting like all these different genres. Like, I'm not sure what the original like context for the Little Mermaid was, but I know a lot of people like on portion now saying like, let's not shoot the original story, but like what is like the original story.
That's interesting. Did everyone take it?
This is your question, I believe.
I think there's an original story always, especially when you want to wax nostalgic or to criticize contemporary representations, but I don't think there is a single original story. I mean, even if you could go back to the Sirens and the Odyssey, there's no single story. And yeah, there have been mermaid myths in oral cultures and indigenous cultures before we have them written down, right? But the contemporary mermaid craze, I'm trying to answer that question, but I actually think it's more your digital generation. I think it is a kind of fan fiction. I think it is social media. I think it is the reason why we're seeing the mermaid craze that I am seeing of the last 10, 15 years, Black and brown, indigenous, queer, eco-criticism, like political mermaids being used not just as like a signal and focus and symbol of something, but actually as a means to serve alternative realities. And I think that is happening because of digital culture. Because it's not the original kind of publishing. It's not the like top-down publishing modes that are giving us the old stories, but it's coming out of somewhere else.
And we were just downstairs in Doheny Library and came across this,
The mermaid figure.
which is in
at the center of the map.
the center of the map, right?
It's
So,
here.
you know. So again, maybe as long, it seems like a fantasy with long legs, excuse the pun. But I will, and again, but just to remind you, because Joellyn Rock's the one who pointed out to me, remember, the ones from the Odyssey, or from the Odyssey, they're birds.
Yeah, the silence.
They're not
But there is a history there.
a link.
There, yeah.
They're
Genealogy,
intertwined?
transformation. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the new phrase over mermaid for a larger movement or fascination with transhumanism? The thing I'm thinking about is Thompson's big book, Post the Folklore, where he kind of traces the early things on the more techno focused transhumanism everywhere. So with older, much older and richer versions of the transhumanism. Is there a moment where the mermaid is part of it? It is not just the tech focused, but there are other people taking on getting alternative realities. That's what it is to take on different identities in different spaces, especially digital spaces. There's kind of movement for thinking of ourselves as being migrated in different ways.
I love that.
And for folks at home, the question was loosely, is there a non-digital wave of this, the mermaid resurgence, I guess, is it, or hybridity and thinking about? Okay,
The mermaid stuff.
a larger movement of transhumanism, to say folks get it.
I think that's brilliant. I'd love to hear Diana talk about that too, because I think that's right. And that's really helpful. I'm at the very beginning stages of this project and trying to answer that question of like, why now? But I do think that you're right. I mean, I do think cosplay and fan fiction and, you know, online and this kind of like thinking. Also, the other trend, which is why I go towards like the history of race and science and also the deep, is that there was this kind of evolutionary argument, Darwinian argument that humans might have evolved we chose to be on land and we could have been in sea. And so some of the literature is kind of going back to an earlier.
Like a polygyny, like a pseudo polygyny
Yes.
argument.
Yes, and so the thinking about the kind of like science, like what constitutes science or technology is also these kind of this mermaid narrative and rethinking of the narrative. Which is why I was thinking of.
Well, I mean, there's something about the mermaid that's actually comfortingly familiar in a world of genetic hybridity where we can't actually see what it looks like to be a genetic hybrid. But with the mermaid, it's like you've got the front half of a Buick and the back half of a Ford.
Right,
Right?
right.
So but when it comes to things like CRISPR and the sort of democratization of genetic engineering, we never really know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the mermaids sometimes sort of fills a purpose or that serves a function. So it's, yes, exactly. Yeah. Not that it's an embrace of the tidiness, but it is comforting to think about alongside that.
All right, that's awesome. All right, Jack and then Luke.
Yeah, going off the topic of like digital spaces.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there are like circles that do like genuinely believe in the existence of actual mermaids like existing on planet Earth right now. Kind of
Wait, you don't?
She has something to show you after.
Oh, okay.
I'm
But, so to go off that, I'm wondering like how that component and how that interpretation has sort of like affected this work in terms of like, you know, that allure and, you know, the possibility of those, you know, existing.
Yeah, that's actually, like, I joke with you, although I, still holding out the Mariana Trench and James Cameron and the Abyss, but, and Avatar, anyway, but, I think that might be part of the now why too, and this kind of ego, like, we are trying to know everything and access and chart everything, and one of the, interventions that our other colleague made, Melody Jew, right? Didn't she was showing us how Google Maps fails when it comes to aquatic spaces, like that that the satellites and the digital imaging and technology cannot explain or interpret the ocean. And so there then leaves something to the old maps of beware here with a mermaid, right? That we still want that fantasy or that idea that there's things that humans can't know and there's spaces we cannot explore, and the mermaid has always presented that on the map. So perhaps that's also part of this moment and this kind of transhumanism and question of like the merging of the global and Google Earth, but also the limitations of it when it comes to the ocean. Because we haven't accessed all of the ocean. We haven't mapped it. It's still this great unknown that we are destroying even if we are trying to understand it.
Wakanda forever. Anyway, I'm not saying it's related. I'm just saying it might have connections. Luke.
Yeah, bringing back in that kind of like technological aspect, have you guys noticed anything in like the research in terms of like how like that hybridity has resulted into a change of thought, especially like something to do with like entanglement and discipline, like I didn't have like blocking algorithms for like knocking out like body creatures, gathering that kind of area.
Pedagogically, definitely. We have plans now to sort of cross teach in all of our choice classes. So do a little bit of code studies, a little bit of literature, poetry, e-lit, race and tech. So in that part, it's been in the material world, very much a hybrid collaboration.
Yeah, and I think we called the piece Entanglements, and this might be where we have to wrap up, but the more we started to play around with any element of this piece, we became immersed in it. And we became entangled in it. And we saw, like, again, these connections that were not tidy between folklore, mythology, contemporary images of mermaids, between the code and the experience of the work, between the music that shows up in the piece and the visuals. The more we started to engage with these things, the more we could see the way the themes had all these knots in them and were resonating and were helping us see connections. So I think it's more the dive into this piece. Again, it really became like a dive into an ocean, I think, for us of connections. And
I want to make a pun about surface and deep reading, but I don't really think it's a pun.
yeah, wait, what would the pun be? Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Well, I mean, sometimes like correlations come together that aren't causation, so just putting things next to each other has actually been really
Yeah.
fruitful.
Yeah,
Surface
that's
versus-
true, and that goes back to the power of Scalar, right? Like just being able to put some of the images and the text next to each other on the screen and then say, what do we see? You know, like, and how do those things work together actually has been, it's kind of changed the way I'm thinking of writing a book now.
Yeah, and again, keep in mind, like when I say we had the code, we had the code, yes, but we had all of the assets. So we could sit there with each of the images. We had access also to Joellyn, so we could talk to her. We've interviewed her and she's in here as well. We knew who the other artists were. We could talk to them about what they were up to. And again, it was long into the piece before I discovered the text of the Little Mermaid superimposed over the piece itself, like the original handwritten text there that's put in there. And again, like that's just like one of those delights that you get with you when you sit with particularly like a rich digital work like this for any amount of time. It starts to open up to you. And again, once you start, so you sort of, it takes like a stillness and a sensitivity. It takes some conversation, someone noticing things. I remember in my limited scuba diving experience, there was a lot of like people pointing things out to you, right? That they noticed. Now I was scuba diving without glass corrected lenses or contact lenses, so I couldn't see any of the things they were pointing to. But again, it's that beauty of collaboration, of getting to go down together and just explore and notice. I guess that's the biggest, notice together.
Were there any questions in the chat? I just don't want to.
There were like fascinating things said in the chat. Like I don't think anything necessarily gets reduced to a question, but you know, Lear makes a comment about the flocking and defense mechanism of birds versus mermaids' connections of thoughts of community. Joellyn says some very nice things about us. Also has some really fascinating points. Maybe I'll read some of these really quickly. Thinking about how the mermaids has specific movement in space in which are tied to a specific environment, as they can't be separated from the community, but also the environment. And then she had a follow-up comment on that and how it exists as its own oceanic space in our lives. What does it mean for us to navigate the digital as we had, even if we don't want to? The obligation to transform and become hybrid in order to access the digital world. Holy crap, that is beautiful. Yeah. So, all right. Well, sad to say it. I think we have come to time. So, first of all, I want to thank my presenters for coming. Thank you all for coming. And we have some refreshments for people here. For people at home, thank you for coming again. If you're interested in events like these, especially online, and you want to sign up on the mailing list, just put your contact information in the chat, and we'll be having other events throughout the academic term and throughout the years. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanks, everybody.